Dr. Julian Carter stood at the gate, his phone buzzing with messages, but he didn't look down. He was used to the chaos of business calls, constant demands, but there was something different about today. Something that felt like the calm before a storm. As he boarded the plane, his crisp black suit and confident stride drew attention. A few passengers turned their heads, perhaps recognizing him. Dr. Julian Carter, the CEO of one of the fastest-growing aviation companies in the country. He wasn't just a businessman. He was an embodiment of success, perseverance, and dignity. But today, even his well-tailored persona couldn't shield him from the unexpected. He walked down the aisle, scanning the rows, his seat number a beacon in his mind. 2A. The plush first-class section, a symbol of his hard-earned position, beckoned with its promise of comfort. But when he reached row 2, a woman, impeccably dressed, was seated in his spot. She was a striking presence. Blonde hair, sharp features, the kind of beauty that demanded attention. She barely glanced up as he approached, immersed in the magazine spread out before her. Julian paused for a moment, wondering if he had made a mistake. He checked his boarding pass again. No, 2A. The tension in the air thickened, and the surrounding passengers seemed to sense something was about to unfold. A few exchanged uncertain glances, their eyes darting between Julian and the woman. He cleared his throat, speaking with the calm authority that had served him throughout his career. "Excuse me, ma'am, I believe you're in my seat." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, one he wasn't used to showing. The woman didn't flinch. She slowly turned her head, her eyes narrowing as she took in his presence. Then, with a faint but unmistakable smirk, she responded in a voice that held a quiet arrogance. "You don't belong here." The words were delivered with a condescension that stung more than the bluntness of them. She didn't just say it, she meant it. Julian's brow furrowed, the shock of her words creeping into his mind like a shadow. He had expected the usual mix-up, a misunderstanding, perhaps even a polite apology. But this was different. He swallowed the rising anger and fought to keep his composure. "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice still calm but firm. "This is my seat, 2A." The woman's lips twisted into a tight smile as she leaned back in her seat, her gaze flicking dismissively to the flight attendant, as if expecting them to resolve the issue without any further effort on her part. The surrounding passengers were silent, but their eyes told a different story. Some looked nervously between Julian and the woman, their eyes flicking back and forth like spectators at a tennis match, while others seemed to lean forward in anticipation, eager to see how this confrontation would unfold. Julian stood tall, his body language unwavering, but the tension in his chest was palpable. This wasn't just about a seat. It was something more. Something he couldn't quite name yet. The unease from the passengers around him was growing, and he realized this moment wasn't simply a misunderstanding. It was the start of something much bigger. Something that had the potential to expose the cracks in a world that constantly tried to tell him he didn't belong. As the flight attendant approached, her eyes flicked to Julian and then to the woman in his seat. The unspoken question hung in the air. Whose side would she take? But Julian knew this wasn't going to be solved with a simple call to the flight crew. This was a challenge, one that wouldn't fade with a polite request or a few words. Something in the woman's demeanor, in her calm defiance, told him this was just the beginning of a much deeper issue, a moment that would reveal more than just a seat dispute. And as he stood there, surrounded by the stares of those who were too afraid to intervene, Julian realized this wasn't going to be a battle won with mere words. It was going to take something more, something he hadn't planned on, but something he was beginning to understand he might have to give. The stakes were higher than he could have imagined. Hey there, my wonderful family and friends. I've missed you all so much, and I've truly missed sharing these moments with you. It's been a bit of a journey with some technical bumps along the way, but don't worry, we're getting everything back on track. Your support means more than ever right now, and I'm so grateful you're still here with me. If you're ready for a new adventure and want to be part of this amazing story, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from. I've got another exciting story lined up for you tomorrow, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. All right, let's dive back into the story. Dr. Julian Carter, the CEO of Collins Aviation, walked with quiet confidence through the bustling terminal. His crisp suit and sharp demeanor made him a recognizable figure, even amidst the chaos of the crowded airport. With every step, he exuded authority, his calm presence cutting through the noise of the crowd. Julian had built his company from the ground up, shaping an empire in the aviation industry where he was respected, admired, and at times feared. But the true measure of his success wasn't just in the billions his company was worth, but in the calm way he handled the pressures of leadership. He was known for his unwavering composure, whether negotiating multi-million-dollar deals or dealing with high-stakes crises. As he approached the boarding gate, he glanced down at his phone, just another routine check before settling into his first-class seat for the flight to his next business meeting. He looked forward to the quiet hours of the flight, a brief escape from the never-ending demands of running a global business. Yet today was destined to be anything but ordinary. Upon boarding the plane, Julian made his way to seat 2A, his usual spot, where he had always sat on past flights. But as he reached the row, his gaze fell on a woman seated in his seat, the reserved boarding pass clearly visible in her hands. She was impeccably dressed, her blonde hair styled with precision, her confidence almost palpable. A quick glance told Julian everything he needed to know. This wasn't a simple mistake. She didn't look up when he stood before her, but her eyes flicked dismissively toward him, sizing him up as if he were an inconvenience. With an exaggerated sigh, she folded her magazine and placed it on the armrest, slowly standing up, just enough to give the impression that she might concede, but not without making him wait a few extra moments. Julian didn't immediately say anything. He stood still, calm, but confused, unsure of how this moment was about to unfold. The woman raised an eyebrow, as if waiting for him to speak, her gaze unwavering, yet distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, authoritative, but not harsh. "Excuse me, that's my seat." Her reaction was immediate and revealing. Her lips curled into a faint smile, the kind of smile that carried an undercurrent of superiority. "I don't think so," she replied coolly, her tone laced with condescension. "This is my seat now." The words, though simple, cut through the air, carrying with them a subtle implication that Julian didn't belong. It was more than just the refusal to vacate the seat. It was the assumption that a man of his appearance, his demeanor, could not possibly have earned the right to sit where she was. The words felt like a challenge, a test of whether Julian would fight for what was his or simply accept the discomfort and quietly back down. Julian stood still for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. His mind raced as he processed what had just transpired. He wasn't accustomed to challenges like this, not in his career, not in his life. He had always been in control, his composure never cracking. But now, facing this subtle but blatant act of racial prejudice, something stirred deep within him. Should he let it slide? Should he simply accept the upgrade they were offering and avoid conflict? He had always chosen the path of diplomacy, of quiet confidence, never wanting to escalate matters unnecessarily, but something inside him pushed back against the notion of simply yielding. A part of him, the part that had fought for every inch of respect in his career, that had built his company while facing adversity and bias, urged him to stand firm. He wasn't just fighting for a seat. He was fighting for respect, for the dignity he had worked so hard to maintain. Another part of him, though, whispered doubts. The flight was already delayed, the eyes of the passengers on him, and the unease in the air was growing. Was this worth the confrontation? Was it worth making a scene? Julian's internal struggle intensified. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure of which path to take. But then, he realized, this wasn't just about a seat. This was about the very system he had spent his life navigating and shaping. The same system that had told him time and again that he had to work twice as hard to earn his place. Now betraying him, testing whether he would fight for his rightful space or quietly retreat in the face of blatant prejudice. What will Dr. Carter do next when the very system he built now betrays him? In that instant, Julian knew the decision he had to make. This was no longer just about an inconvenient moment in a first-class cabin. It was about standing up for what was right, even if the cost was higher than he had ever anticipated. Dr. Julian Carter's life was a delicate balance of success and unwavering focus. As CEO of Collins Aviation, one of the fastest-growing airlines in the world, he had spent years cultivating an empire from scratch. His name was known in the business world, synonymous with precision, leadership, and unmatched determination. His company, a beacon of innovation in the aviation industry, was respected and envied. But behind the polished exterior of power, prestige, and wealth was a man who had fought every day of his life to carve out a place in a world that often tried to tell him he didn't belong.
The morning began like any other. The sun streamed through the windows of his penthouse apartment, casting long shadows on the sleek, modern furniture. Julian stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie with practiced precision, his reflection giving him a moment of pause. He didn't see just the CEO of Collins Aviation staring back at him. He saw a man who had learned to walk through life with a calm composure, always aware that his every move was being scrutinized. Being a black man in a predominantly white, high-powered industry had made him all too familiar with the quiet stares and subtle dismissals. He had built his empire, but he had always known that his path would be different, harder. His phone buzzed on the marble countertop, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his chief operating officer, Sarah. "Julian, just a heads up, board meeting at 2 p.m. The investors want to talk about expansion. I've already prepared the proposal for you. Can't wait to discuss it." Julian smiled, tapping a quick reply. "Thanks, Sarah. I'll be there." He then walked to the kitchen, where the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. His wife, Michelle, was already at the table, her laptop open, absorbed in her work. Michelle was his rock, his grounding force. She had been with him through the darkest times of his career and life, supporting him when the weight of the world seemed unbearable. "Morning, love," Michelle greeted, looking up from her screen with a warm smile that instantly put him at ease. "Morning, babe," Julian replied, his voice calm but carrying a note of affection. He leaned in and kissed her forehead before grabbing his coffee. "How's your day shaping up?" Michelle raised an eyebrow, her gaze never leaving her screen. "Busy, but nothing I can't handle." She paused, the corner of her mouth turning up into a smile. "How about you? Big meeting today?"
Julian nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. Another one of those can't-lose moments. We're talking about expansion into the Asian market. Investors are excited. "Good," she said with a soft chuckle, "but don't let them get too excited. You know how they get." Julian smiled at the familiarity of her words. "You know I can handle it." They shared a quiet moment before Julian turned to leave for the office, Michelle offering her usual reminder, "Don't forget to call your mom tonight. She's been asking about you." Julian nodded, his face softening. "I will. Love you." "Love you too," she replied, her voice laced with a quiet strength that matched his own. The office was just as sleek as the apartment, a testament to Julian's hard work. His team, a close-knit group of professionals, awaited him in the glass-walled boardroom. As he entered, the room fell silent for a moment, everyone rising to greet him. Julian's calm demeanor set the tone. He was no ordinary CEO. He wasn't just the figurehead at the top of a massive company. He was a leader. But more importantly, he was someone who had earned his place. His gaze swept across the room, taking in his team's faces. Their trust in him was evident, a reflection of the respect he had earned over years of tireless effort. "Morning, everyone," he said, his voice steady, almost serene. "Let's get down to it." As the team dove into their presentation, Julian remained composed, his sharp mind absorbing every detail. He asked questions, offered solutions, and, when necessary, pushed back with the precision of a man who knew his worth. He had earned the right to be there, not just because of his success, but because of the sacrifices he had made along the way. Yet, despite the smooth flow of the meeting, there was an undercurrent of tension that only Julian could sense. He'd experienced it before, the subtle dismissals that came with being a black man in a leadership role. Whether it was an investor who spoke over him, a client who questioned his authority, or an executive who hesitated to follow his lead, Julian had learned to tune out the quiet racism that crept into every interaction. But it wasn't always easy. The moments that stuck with him were the ones he couldn't shake, the ones that stayed in his gut, gnawing at him. Later that evening, as he sat at his desk, reviewing the proposal for the Asian expansion, his phone rang. It was his mother. "Hey, Mom," Julian answered, his tone shifting slightly, as it always did when he spoke with her. "Julian, my boy," his mother's warm voice came through, instantly comforting. "How's everything going? I saw you on the news today. Those investors are eager, huh?" Julian chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, they're excited, but you know how it goes. Everyone has their own agenda." "Don't let them push you too hard," his mother said, a hint of concern in her voice. "You've built something beautiful, but don't forget who you are and where you came from. They'll try to tell you you're not enough, that you're taking too much space. Don't listen to them." Julian felt his chest tighten. His mother's words resonated deeply. He had heard that same message throughout his life, his entire career. "You're taking up too much space. You're not like them. You don't belong here." The whispering doubts that had followed him since his early days, from his first job interview to his rise in the corporate world. Every success had come with the knowledge that his worth was always questioned, often by those who didn't look like him. But his mother's words grounded him. "Don't forget who you are." "I won't, Mom. I promise," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not backing down." After a brief pause, she replied, "I know you're strong, Julian, but don't forget to rest. You can't fight everyone all the time." He smiled, grateful for her wisdom. "I will. Thanks for the reminder, Mom. I'll talk to you soon." As he hung up the phone, Julian took a deep breath. He was used to the weight of the world on his shoulders. But today, as he prepared for the challenges ahead, he couldn't shake the memory of those moments. Times when he was told he didn't belong. Times when the world tried to place limits on him. And for a moment, he thought about how far he had come, how much he had fought to build something that was his, despite the forces that had tried to stop him. But this time, he was determined. He wasn't going to back down. Not today, not ever. The fight was bigger than just proving himself. It was about showing the world that he had earned his place. Every step, every inch of ground. As he closed his eyes, Julian knew that the moment he'd been preparing for was fast approaching. He could feel it in his bones. The fight for his dignity and the truth of his worth was about to begin. And this time, he wouldn't let anyone tell him he didn't belong. The constant pressure was never far behind. At work, the stakes were sky high. Every decision he made had ramifications not just for the company, but for the countless people who depended on his leadership. Yet the weight of these responsibilities often felt lighter than the invisible pressure he carried in his personal life, the pressure of proving himself in a world that had been built to make him feel as though he didn't quite belong. Despite everything Julian had achieved, there were moments when he couldn't escape the feeling that he was still fighting for acceptance. It was a battle that never seemed to end, no matter how many victories he claimed. The constant, nagging sense that his success was always measured differently than that of his white counterparts. Every milestone, every promotion, every deal closed felt like an accomplishment, but also like an invitation to prove that he deserved it, again and again. Julian was well aware that his success had been met with both admiration and skepticism. While his colleagues praised his intellect and business acumen, there was always the unspoken question in the back of their minds. Did he really earn this, or was he just lucky? For years, he had worked twice as hard to prove that his abilities weren't a fluke. But even when he succeeded, there was always an underlying doubt cast upon his achievements. The idea of working harder to achieve the same recognition as others was a familiar refrain in his life. And even now, as a powerful CEO, he felt the weight of that unrelenting scrutiny, constantly striving to prove his worth to those who would never fully understand the battles he had fought to get here. The question of belonging never truly left him. Julian often wondered if his success would ever be enough, or if he would always be forced to fight for it, even in spaces where he had already earned his place. Julian had encountered prejudice at every turn in his life, subtle moments that had shaped him, moments that had hardened him. He could still remember the sting of his first job interview, fresh out of business school. The hiring manager had barely looked at him during the entire meeting, instead focusing on his resume as if his presence was an afterthought. It wasn't the rejection that stung the most, it was the uncomfortable silence that followed, the clear implication that a black man like Julian had no business sitting in a room with executives of a prestigious company. He had shrugged it off at the time, determined to prove them wrong, but deep down he knew it wouldn't be the last time he'd face this kind of discrimination. Over the years, he had encountered it in more insidious forms. At one major conference, when he had spoken confidently in front of a room full of industry leaders, he noticed the way some of them exchanged glances, some with surprise, others with barely disguised skepticism. In that moment, he realized that his success as a CEO wasn't just about his abilities, it was about the expectations placed on him, the challenge of being perceived as someone who could achieve success despite the odds stacked against him. At social events, he often found himself at the center of awkward conversations. Someone would make a passing remark, a joke that was harmless, but which lingered in the air, making him feel like an outsider in a room full of people who shared little more than a similar skin tone. He had learned to smile through these moments, to remain composed, to never let his discomfort show. But inside, he seethed, angry at the unfairness of it all, frustrated by the fact that his worth was constantly questioned. Dr. Carter had mastered the art of the public persona, the confident CEO who walked into boardrooms with authority, the man who charmed investors and effortlessly navigated high-stakes negotiations. He had become a symbol of success, a man who had climbed the corporate ladder with unmatched tenacity. But behind that image was a different reality, a reality that no one saw. In the quiet of his office, after the meetings were over and the crowds had dispersed, Julian often found himself exhausted, not just from the demands of running a business, but from the mental and emotional toll of constantly having to prove himself. He would stare out of his office window, watching the world go by, thinking about the battles no one knew he was fighting. It wasn't just the pressure of being a CEO, it was the emotional labor of navigating a world that often told him he didn't belong. Even in the comfort of his home, where he was surrounded by his family and friends, there were moments when Julian felt the weight of the world bearing down on him. At family gatherings, he would sometimes find himself the subject of subtle, uncomfortable questions from relatives who didn't quite understand the isolation he felt. They meant well, but they didn't see the struggles he faced every day. At times, his success seemed like an outlier, a rare exception in a world that still often viewed people like him as anomalies, as exceptions to the rule. His wife, Michelle, knew this better than anyone. She was his emotional anchor, the one person who saw through the calm exterior, who understood the toll his role took on him. She knew that when he came home after a long day, he wasn't just exhausted from work. He was exhausted from fighting battles that no one else could see. But despite the internal struggles, Julian never let it show. He was a master of keeping his emotions in check, of maintaining that cool, calm, collected facade that had become his trademark. The world saw him as a visionary leader, but in the quiet moments, he carried the weight of unspoken prejudices, the knowledge that no matter how far he went, there would always be those who doubted his place at the table. The moment the flight attendants arrived, the tension in the air grew palpable. Julian Carter stood, still composed, but his heart began to pound in his chest. He had been calm, polite, and patient, but Victoria Langford was testing every ounce of his restraint. The look on her face, that smug indifference, only made things worse. She had claimed his seat without a second thought, and now, it seemed, she was trying to claim the moral high ground too. As the flight attendants approached, Julian's mind raced. He had every right to be in that seat. It was his, after all. His boarding pass, clear as day, matched the seat number. Yet here they were, pretending like he was the one who was causing the problem. The gate agent, a young woman with an apologetic smile, tried to diffuse the situation with empty words.
"Excuse me, sir," she said, voice quivering. "There must have been some confusion. The passenger in 2A seems to be under the impression that she's in the right seat. Could you perhaps take a different seat for the time being?" Her tone was hesitant, but there was an underlying message. Don't make this a scene. Just comply. Julian's jaw tightened. Take a different seat? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The seat was clearly his. He wasn't going to be moved. Not now? Not ever. Victoria, now looking up from her magazine with an almost bored expression, folded her arms. "You're in my seat," she said again, as if it was the simplest thing in the world. "The seat's mine. You can just go sit somewhere else." Her words felt like a slap in the face, subtle but demeaning. It wasn't about the seat, not really. It was about the unspoken message she was sending, the kind of quiet racism that said, "You don't belong here, and I do." As Julian looked around, he could see the silent reactions of the passengers, some avoiding eye contact, others stealing glances as if watching a silent war unfold. He could feel the weight of their gaze, their unspoken judgments. The tension was thick, and as the flight attendants hesitated, he realized this wasn't a small misunderstanding. This wasn't going to be resolved with a polite exchange or a quiet apology. He had to act, and act fast. Without a word, he pulled out his phone and dialed the airline's customer service number. The phone rang once, twice, before a voice on the other end answered, almost too calmly. "Good evening. How can I assist you?" The voice was smooth, professional, but there was an undercurrent of indifference in the way the woman spoke.
"I'm Dr. Julian Carter, and I'm currently on your flight. There seems to be a misunderstanding regarding my seat," he began, keeping his tone even and steady, despite the frustration simmering underneath. "I am in 2A, and a passenger is refusing to vacate the seat. I've already tried to resolve this peacefully, but it seems the situation is escalating. There was a brief pause, a click, as the customer service agent seemed to put him on hold for a moment before returning. "Thank you for your patience, Dr. Carter. I've spoken to our staff on board, and they've informed me that it's a minor confusion. Perhaps we can find an alternative seat for you. We're happy to offer you an upgrade." The word stung. An alternative seat. Upgrade. It felt like a dismissal, a quick way to placate him without acknowledging the deeper issue at hand. Julian's mind raced. This wasn't about comfort, about seating arrangements, or about upgrades. This was about respect, about his place in the world, and no amount of free upgrades could make him forget that. His voice remained calm, but there was an undeniable firmness in his words. "If you believe I should be removed, then I suggest you call someone who can make that decision," he said, each word deliberate. "I am not moving." The flight attendants looked on, their expressions now a mixture of confusion and concern. Julian could see them exchange glances, unsure of how to handle the situation. The young flight attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously from Julian to Victoria, who was now watching with an almost bored expression, as if she expected the entire thing to be swept under the rug.
Victoria spoke up, her voice dripping with condescension. "I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this. It's just a seat. Why don't you take the upgrade and move on? It's not like it's the end of the world." But for Julian, it was the principle of the matter. It wasn't about the seat. It was about what this moment represented. It was about being told, once again, that he didn't belong. And he wasn't going to let that slide. Not anymore. His calm, unassuming nature, something he had spent a lifetime cultivating, began to shift. The polite requests, the quiet insistence, those things were no longer enough. As the situation unfolded, Julian felt a fire inside him begin to burn. He wasn't just fighting for the seat, he was fighting for his dignity, for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every injustice he had ever faced without a voice to speak out. The stakes grew higher, and Julian knew he couldn't back down. The moment wasn't just about this flight, it was about every encounter he'd ever had that sought to remind him of his place in a world that didn't always accept him. It was about everything he had worked for, the empire he had built with his own two hands, and whether he would let it be reduced to something so small as a seat dispute. As Julian stood there, a quiet resolve taking over his features, the tension in the cabin thickened. Passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring softly, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. Julian's determination was unmistakable. He wasn't going to let this go. Key question. Would Julian compromise and take the upgrade, letting it go to avoid conflict, or would he risk everything for justice? Would he stand up for the dignity that so many had tried to strip away, even if it cost him everything?
This moment wasn't just a fight for a seat. It was a fight for respect, a fight for his right to exist in a space where others assumed he didn't belong. And in that moment, Julian knew that he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for a future where this kind of injustice could no longer thrive, where every person, no matter who they were, could stand proudly in the spaces they had earned. The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and only one thing was certain. Julian Carter would not back down. The situation was escalating, and Julian Carter could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. What had started as a simple dispute over a seat had now become a battleground for something much larger, something that he had not anticipated. The moment the altercation had gone public, the media had caught fire, and the story began to spread faster than he could have imagined.
Headlines appeared, blasting across screens and newspapers, each one pushing the narrative of a successful black CEO being humiliated over something as trivial as a first-class seat. But this wasn't trivial to Julian. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about his dignity and about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. It didn't take long for the media to latch on to the story. The first reports were already spreading like wildfire. Tweets, posts, news stories, each one adding fuel to the fire. People from all walks of life began to share their opinions, some in support of Julian, others questioning why he didn't simply accept an upgrade and move on. As the story snowballed, the tension in the media grew palpable. The world was watching, and they wanted answers. Was this just a misunderstanding, or was there something darker lurking beneath the surface?
Meanwhile, in the quiet, sleek offices of Collins Aviation, the legal team was hard at work, poring over the airline's internal policies, trying to uncover any discrepancies or patterns that could be linked to the incident. Julian had called in his lawyers immediately after the flight, demanding that they look into the airline's history. What they discovered wasn't just shocking, it was horrifying. It wasn't just about the flight incident. It wasn't just about the refusal to vacate a seat. What Julian's legal team uncovered was a deeply ingrained pattern of racial discrimination that ran through the airline's policies. It wasn't limited to a few isolated incidents. It was systematic. The more they dug, the more they found that black passengers, particularly those in first class, had faced similar treatment. There were reports of passengers being quietly moved from seats, offered upgrades to less desirable accommodations, and being treated with subtle disdain, all because of the color of their skin. Julian's lawyer, Sarah Matthews, called him late one night with the results. She was calm on the phone, but Julian could hear the frustration in her voice as she spoke. "Julian, what we've found, it's worse than we thought. This isn't an isolated issue. There's a pattern here, and it goes back years. The airline has, time and time again, used these vague policies to deprioritize black passengers. They've been making decisions based on who they think belongs in first class, and it's never been about race on paper, but it's obvious what's happening when you look at the history."
Julian's heart sank as the words settled in. He had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made him feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. The system he had spent so many years navigating, building, and challenging was, in the end, just as flawed as the system that had denied him a place in many spaces throughout his life. But now, there was no going back. This wasn't just about his incident on one flight. This was about systemic prejudice in an industry that Julian had worked so hard to be a part of. And now, that very system was crumbling beneath him. The media buzzed louder by the day. More stories were published, each one diving deeper into the allegations of discrimination. Interviews with aviation experts, social justice activists, and even former employees who had worked for the airline painted a clearer picture. This was not just an isolated incident. There were whispers of similar occurrences at airports across the world. Passengers shared stories on social media detailing how they had been humiliated, asked to move, or even had their boarding passes questioned in the same manner that Julian had been. The more the media tried to suppress the story, the more it grew. It was no longer just about one incident. The cracks in the system were becoming undeniable. Julian was beginning to realize the magnitude of what he was up against. The airline's executives were trying to bury the story, desperately issuing statements and pulling strings behind closed doors to quiet the noise. They wanted the issue to disappear, to return to business as usual. But Julian could feel it. He couldn't back down now. There was too much at stake. Then one evening, as Julian sat in his office, the phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something about the timing made him pick it up. "Mr. Carter," the voice on the other end whispered,
I have information you need. I'm an employee of Sky Continental, and what you've uncovered is just the tip of the iceberg. They've been covering up discrimination for years, but it's not just you. It's all over. Passengers of color, especially those traveling alone or in first class, they're being targeted. I've seen it firsthand, and I can't stay quiet anymore."
The voice belonged to a whistleblower, a person working within the airline who had witnessed the discrimination firsthand and could no longer remain silent. Julian listened intently as the details unfolded. The company's senior leadership was aware of the practices, had known for years, but had done little to nothing to address it. In fact, they had encouraged it, implementing policies and training that subtly reinforced biases under the guise of customer preference or customer service. This wasn't just one bad apple. This was a systemic problem, deep-rooted in the very fabric of the airline's operations. And now Julian had the evidence to prove it. But the question remained, what would he do with it? The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a fight for his own dignity. It was a fight for every person who had ever been humiliated in silence, for every passenger who had been forced to sit at the back of the plane or in a seat they didn't deserve, simply because of the color of their skin. His resolve strengthened. The stakes were no longer just about him. This was bigger than any one incident. This was about the entire aviation industry, and it was time for it to be held accountable. He couldn't back down. Not now. Not after all this. He picked up the phone and dialed his lawyer, Sarah. "This isn't just about one flight," he said, his voice unwavering. "This is about every seat, every boarding pass, every act of bias. We're going to expose them all. It's time to make this go public." The tension continued to build. With each new revelation, Julian's resolve grew. He was no longer just a CEO fighting for his own reputation. He was now the face of something far greater, an entire movement fighting for justice in an industry that had turned a blind eye for too long. The question now was no longer what would Julian do next. It was how far was he willing to go to make sure that this injustice was exposed for the world to see. Would the airline's efforts to suppress the truth succeed, or would Julian Carter's fight ignite a fire that could never be extinguished? As the media storm raged on and more voices joined the chorus, one thing became clear. This was just the beginning, and Julian Carter was ready to take it all the way to the top. The weight of Julian Carter's discoveries hit him like a freight train. The more he dug into the depths of the airline's operations, the more the truth unraveled before him. What had started as a personal fight for justice over a seat that had been wrongfully occupied was now a deepening battle with the very institution he had worked so hard to build. An institution that had, for too long, quietly tolerated a deep, systemic issue. Julian had long considered Sky Continental to be more than just a business venture. As a major shareholder, he had invested not only his money, but his time, his energy, and his reputation. The airline was supposed to reflect his own values of fairness, opportunity, and equality. But the more Julian's legal team uncovered, the more it became clear that the airline's leadership had quietly, and perhaps deliberately, turned a blind eye to its internal biases. This was no isolated incident, no mistake that could be blamed on a few rogue employees. This was a culture that ran so deeply within the airline's walls that it had infected the very core of its operations.
But the most shocking revelation of all came when Julian learned of the role Daniel Harrington, the CEO of Sky Continental, had played in the whole debacle. It wasn't just that Harrington had failed to act in the face of mounting evidence of racial discrimination. It was worse. Daniel Harrington had actively sided with Victoria Langford, the woman who had caused the initial stir by refusing to vacate Julian's seat. The whispers Julian had heard about the CEO's stance on the issue were confirmed, and it hit Julian like a punch to the gut. Daniel Harrington had been quietly backing Victoria all along, pressuring his team to sweep the issue under the rug, downplaying the racial aspects, and framing it as a simple misunderstanding. Julian's anger simmered beneath the surface as he pieced the story together. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't a single rogue action. It was a pattern. Harrington and the senior leadership had supported Victoria not because of her innocence, but because she represented the old guard of a corporate world that had always been blind to the biases lurking just beneath the surface. They were complicit, actively covering for the discriminatory practices that had festered for years within Sky Continental. Julian's stomach twisted as the realization sank in. The very system he had fought to build, the one he thought was founded on fairness and respect, had been poisoned by the same prejudice he had fought against his entire life. The betrayal was so much worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just Victoria Langford trying to take what was his. It was an entire corporate system that had worked tirelessly to suppress the truth, to maintain the status quo, and to keep the undercurrent of racism hidden behind a polished exterior of customer service and corporate success. The confrontation was inevitable. Julian's office felt colder as he dialed Harrington's number. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. He had spent years cultivating relationships, protecting his reputation, and building an empire, but none of that mattered now, not when everything he stood for was under attack. This wasn't just about a fight for justice over a seat. This was about the very integrity of the industry he had poured his life into.
When Daniel's voice finally came through on the line, it was warm, almost jovial, as if nothing in the world could be wrong. "Julian, it's been a while, my friend. How's everything going? I've been hearing some buzz about what happened on that flight of yours." Julian didn't hesitate. His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "You've been protecting her all along, haven't you, Daniel? Your support wasn't just for the seat, it was for the system." The words landed with a sickening weight. For a moment there was silence on the other end of the line, and Julian could almost hear the gears turning in Harrington's head, trying to figure out how to dodge the truth. But Julian wasn't interested in listening to half-truths anymore. He knew what was at stake. He had seen the pattern, and now he knew that there was no escaping the truth. Harrington finally spoke, his voice less friendly, more defensive. "Julian, you have to understand, this isn't as simple as you're making it out to be. It's about maintaining the company's image, ensuring that we don't make a spectacle out of something trivial. What happened wasn't ideal, but we're handling it internally." "Internally?" Julian's voice rose with frustration. "You've been covering it up. You've been turning a blind eye to the very thing I've been fighting against my entire career. This isn't about protecting the airline's image, it's about protecting the biases that run through its veins."
There was another pause. Julian could feel the tension building in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't backing down. Not this time. He had come too far, seen too much, and worked too hard to let this slip by. "I've spent my life building something I believed in," Julian continued, his voice gaining strength. "But what I'm seeing now, it's not just one mistake, Daniel. It's a system that's broken, and you're part of it." The air between them seemed to crackle with tension. Harrington's response was more measured, but the anger in his tone was undeniable. "Julian, you're letting emotions cloud your judgment. This isn't the way to handle things. You're letting a personal matter affect your business decisions." "No, Daniel," Julian snapped. "What's personal here is the truth, and I won't stand by while you protect the very system that's kept people like me from getting the respect we deserve." The call ended abruptly, leaving Julian standing alone in his office. The betrayal stung, but he knew it was a turning point. He wasn't just fighting for a seat or for one person's dignity anymore. This had become a battle for truth, a battle against the corporate machine that had allowed racism to thrive in the shadows for too long. Julian's thoughts were a whirlwind as he leaned back in his chair, staring out of his office window. He could feel the betrayal sinking in with every passing second. Daniel Harrington, the man who had been the face of Sky Continental, the man who had promised to champion progress and fairness, was nothing more than another cog in the very system that had sought to diminish Julian's worth for years. But there was no turning back now. Julian knew he had to make a decision that would change everything. His voice had already shaken the corporate world. It was time to take this fight public. The stakes were too high, and the truth was too important. If he remained silent, if he allowed the airline to sweep this under the rug, he would be complicit in the very thing he had fought against his entire life.
He reached for his phone, dialing Sarah Matthews, his trusted lawyer. "It's time," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "We go public. This ends now. We expose the leadership, expose the whole system." Will Julian continue to stand firm, or will he lose his position as a shareholder to fight for justice? As Julian prepared to take this fight to the public, one question weighed heavily on his mind. Would he lose everything, his position, his investments, his reputation, by standing up for what was right? Or would he become the catalyst for a much-needed change, not just in the airline industry, but in corporate America as a whole? As the media storm began to build, Julian could already feel the winds of change swirling around him. The world was watching, and he wasn't about to back down now. The decision was made. The battle lines had been drawn, and in the fight for justice, nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of the world seemed to press down on Julian Carter with an intensity he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the media frenzy, the endless barrage of headlines that had painted him as a man with a cause. It was the fallout. Investors were pulling back, nervous about the legal battle he had ignited with Sky Continental. His phone was constantly buzzing with calls from board members, each more concerned than the last. The questions were starting to shift from "What's happening with the airline?" to "What's happening with you, Julian?" The face of Collins Aviation, the man who had fought so hard to carve out a place in a predominantly white, high-powered industry, was now staring at the possibility of losing everything he had worked for. At first, the calls came from allies, people who had stood by him, people who had respected his fight and his vision. But now, those same voices were filled with doubt. "Julian, you've done enough. You've made your point," one investor said during a tense phone call. "This isn't just about a seat on a plane anymore. You're risking your empire. The company's stock has already dropped 10%. If this goes further, we're looking at a full-blown financial disaster." The words stung, sharper than he expected. He had known that this battle would have consequences, but hearing it from someone who had once praised him, someone who had believed in his leadership, it hit differently. And the media was only making things worse. What had once been a rallying cry for justice, a moment where people saw him as a hero fighting for equality, had now turned into a spectacle. The headlines, once supportive, had started to twist. "CEO or crusader, Julian Carter's fight for justice is costing him his company." The negative press was everywhere. People who had once admired him now questioned his judgment. Was he willing to sacrifice everything for one fight? Was it worth it? Then the worst happened. The airline stock began to plummet. The market reacted swiftly and violently, and Julian felt the sting of every point lost in real time. He wasn't just losing money, he was losing the respect and trust of people who had once believed in his leadership. The legal battles with Sky Continental had already drained his emotional reserves, and now
The financial damage was doing its own work. Investors were pulling out. The media was portraying him as reckless, and his own allies, people he had considered friends, were starting to distance themselves.
Julian walked into his office one late evening, the room dimly lit, the soft hum of the city outside his window doing little to calm the storm swirling inside him. His office, once a place of confidence and control, felt foreign now. He sat in his chair, staring at the numbers flashing on his computer screen. The stock had dropped another 5%. What had he done? Was it really worth it? Had he been too hasty in his decision to take a stand? Had he underestimated the cost of speaking truth to power? His thoughts turned inward. "I've fought for everything I've ever earned," he thought. He had clawed his way to the top of the aviation industry, building Collins Aviation from the ground up. The late nights, the sacrifices, the years spent proving himself in a world that had tried to write him off. Every step had been a battle, but it had brought him to a place of power, until now. But is this worth losing everything? Julian leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, letting the weight of the questions settle in his chest. He had spent his life fighting to prove that he belonged, fighting against the subtle, pervasive racism that had followed him every step of the way. But now, as the stakes continued to rise, he was faced with a moment of reckoning. Was this fight for justice worth the sacrifice of everything he had built? His empire? His company? His career? His mind flashed back to the early days, to the times when his resolve had been tested, when the doors had been slammed in his face, when the subtle hints of bias had become too loud to ignore. He could still remember the sting of his first job interview, the look on the hiring manager's face when he realized Julian wasn't just another white, well-connected candidate. The dismissiveness that followed, the polite but thinly veiled rejection. He had fought through that, built a name for himself in an industry that had underestimated him, that had told him time and again that he didn't belong.
There was the time when a senior executive at a major conference had questioned his qualifications in front of a room full of peers. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Julian? This is a big job, and we're looking for someone who can handle it." The words had stung, but he had kept his head high, had smiled politely, and had proven them wrong with every move he made after. His career had been a series of those moments, silent rebukes, small setbacks, but each one had fueled him to prove them wrong. But now, as the pressure mounted, Julian's mind turned back to the present. Was this fight the same? Was he simply pushing forward out of sheer determination to prove that he could, even when everything seemed to be falling apart? Or was there something more? His phone buzzed on the desk in front of him, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text message from Michelle, his wife. "How's everything? I'm worried about you. Call me when you can." Julian stared at the message for a moment, feeling a pang in his chest. Michelle had always been his rock, the one person who understood the toll of his journey had taken on him. She had seen him at his lowest, when he was ready to give up on everything, and had always been there to remind him of why he kept fighting. But now, even her support seemed distant. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of losing everything. The weight of the decision was unbearable. Would his fight for justice destroy him? Was this the moment when his empire crumbled, all because he stood up for what he believed in? Or was there a way to win this battle without losing everything?
He took a deep breath, pushing away the crushing wave of doubt that was threatening to pull him under. He had come too far, fought too hard to let fear control his actions now. The question was no longer about if he would win this battle. It was about whether he had the strength to fight through the darkest moments and come out on the other side, having made the change he had always dreamed of. "I've fought for everything I've ever earned, but is this worth losing everything?" Julian whispered to himself, the weight of those words hanging heavily in the silence of the room. As the clock ticked on, Julian made a decision. He wasn't going to back down.
He wasn't going to let the fear of failure or the pressure of losing everything stop him from doing what was right. He knew that the road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was crystal clear. He couldn't let this moment pass, not after everything he had fought for. The stakes had never been higher, and as Julian stood at the precipice of everything he had built, the questions flooded his mind. Would he lose it all, or would he finally force the world to change? The fight for justice had never been so personal. The night was quiet, the city lights outside Julian's office flickering like distant stars in the dark sky. Inside, the soft hum of his computer and the occasional shuffle of papers were the only sounds breaking the silence. Julian sat in his chair, staring out the window, feeling the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. He had spent years building Collins Aviation, crafting it into something he could be proud of, a company that stood for fairness, integrity, and opportunity. But now, everything he had worked for was under threat. The media was relentless, his investors anxious, and the legal battle with Sky Continental seemed like it was going to drag on for months, maybe even years. The path ahead was uncertain, and Julian felt the burden of his decision closing in on him.
But just when he thought he couldn't carry the weight any longer, his phone buzzed. It was an old text message from his mother, one he had saved years ago. She had passed away not long after his rise to CEO, and her wisdom had always been a guiding light in his life. His thumb hovered over the message before he opened it, the familiar sense of loss rising in his chest. He had kept this message as a reminder of the quiet strength she had always instilled in him, the same strength that had carried him through years of adversity. The message read, "Remember, Julian, standing firm in the face of adversity is what truly matters. You can't control the world, but you can control your choices. Never forget, your dignity is your own to protect. Don't ever let anyone take that from you." The words hit him harder than he expected, the emotional weight of them resonating deep within him. His mother had always been his biggest supporter, the one person who had never doubted his ability to overcome the obstacles that had been placed in his way. She had faced her own battles, growing up in a world where she had been told her worth was less than that of others, where she had been denied opportunities simply because of the color of her skin. And yet, despite everything, she had always told him to fight for what was right. As Julian stared at the message, the fog of doubt that had clouded his mind began to lift. His mother's words were a clarion call, a reminder that this fight was never just about him. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. If he backed down now, if he let Sky Continental and the world's prejudice define him, he would be losing something far more important than any seat on a plane. He would be losing his integrity.
His phone buzzed again. It was Rachel, his trusted colleague, who had been his anchor throughout this fight. She had stood by his side when the story first broke, offering support when the pressure from the media and investors had been at its highest. But now, as the stakes grew higher and the attacks more personal, Rachel had become more than just an ally. She was a friend, someone who understood the depth of his struggle and the sacrifices he had made to get to this point. Julian answered the phone with a quiet, "Rachel?" "Rachel," she said softly, "I know this has been hard, but I think it's time we take the next step. This fight? This is bigger than just us now. It's bigger than one incident on a flight. The world is watching, and it's time to take a stand." The words hung in the air, but Julian already knew what she was going to say. The pieces were falling into place in his mind. The fight for his dignity, for the rights of all those who had been denied their rightful place, could no longer be ignored. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. "This is not about one seat anymore," Julian said, his voice steady, a quiet determination rising within him. "This is about standing up for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong." Rachel's voice softened,
full of understanding. "You've always said we're in this for the long haul, Julian, but I think it's time to make it official. We take this to the courts. We demand change. We put an end to the policies and practices that have let this continue for so long." Julian closed his eyes, a deep breath escaping his lungs as he thought about everything he had worked for, the empire he had built, the family he had supported, and the principles that had always guided him. Was this fight worth losing everything? The question echoed in his mind once again, but as he thought about the moment his mother had passed away, the conversation they had shared in the final days, and the promise he had made to never give up, he knew what he had to do.
"If I step down now," Julian said, the words feeling like a weight lifting off his chest, "I am saying that dignity can be negotiated. I won't do that. Not for this. Not for anything." It was a breakthrough moment for Julian, a moment of emotional clarity that solidified his decision. The path ahead would be difficult. The media would continue to spin the story against him, investors would continue to pull back, and the legal battle would be long and exhausting. But he knew that stepping back was not an option, not when the stakes were so high. Rachel's voice crackled through the phone with a quiet strength. "I'm with you, Julian. We're with you. Let's take this fight public. Let's expose them for what they are." Julian felt the weight of those words, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. This wasn't just about the company he had built. This was about something bigger than him, something that transcended the financial stakes and the corporate empire. It was about standing for the people who had been silenced, for the voices that had been ignored, and for the dignity that every human being deserved. He stood up from his desk and walked toward the window, looking out at the city below. It was quiet out there, peaceful even. But inside, Julian knew that the real battle was just beginning. He would take this fight to the courts. He would demand justice for every person who had ever been discriminated against, for every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough, for every person who had ever felt like they didn't belong. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Julian Carter would not back down. Not now. Not ever. "If I step down now, I am saying that dignity can be negotiated. I won't do that." The decision was made. The fight was on. And Julian Carter was ready to stand firm, to fight for what was right, and to ensure that the voices of the oppressed would no longer be ignored. The world would know his name, not just as the CEO of Collins Aviation, but as the man who refused to let injustice go unanswered. The courtroom was silent, the weight of what was about to unfold hanging thick in the air. Julian Carter sat at the witness stand, his heart pounding with an intensity he had never felt before. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about one dispute over a seat on a plane. This was the culmination of years of struggle, years of proving that he belonged, and years of fighting a system that had tried to crush him at every turn. The courtroom was packed with onlookers, journalists scribbling furiously, their cameras flashing intermittently. The tension was palpable, the atmosphere electric. Today, the world was watching, and Julian knew that the outcome of this case would ripple far beyond just Sky Continental. It was about the systemic racial discrimination that had plagued industries for decades, about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. His lawyer, Sarah Matthews, stood beside him, her demeanor calm but intense. She had been with him every step of the way, guiding him through the chaos, helping him navigate the legal intricacies of this battle. Together, they had uncovered the truth, the ugly, undeniable truth that Sky Continental had systematically discriminated against black passengers, particularly those in positions of power. But it wasn't just about one incident. It was about an entire culture, an entire industry built on policies that knowingly or unknowingly perpetuated racial bias. Now it was time to make that truth known.
The prosecutor had just finished their cross-examination, and the defense was preparing for their rebuttal. But before they could speak, Julian stood up. The room grew quiet as he approached the podium, the weight of his actions settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about providing evidence. This was about speaking to the heart of the matter. It was about making sure the jury, the public, and the world understood that this fight was bigger than just one man, bigger than just one airline. As he began to speak, Julian's voice was steady, but the power behind his words was undeniable. "I didn't get here by accident," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room, locking eyes with the jury. "I didn't get here by luck or by favor. I got here because I worked harder, fought harder, and earned my place in this world. But that wasn't enough for some people. Because I'm a black man, I was constantly told I didn't belong in these rooms. And it wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's been dismissed, ignored, and silenced for being different." His words hung in the air, the truth of them cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. "I've been to places where people look at me and wonder if I belong. I've faced discrimination in more subtle forms than you can imagine. But this isn't just about one seat on a plane. This is about a system that has been in place for too long, a system that wasn't built for everyone. It was built to keep people like me out." Julian paused, his chest rising with the weight of his emotions. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a man who had faced every form of bias and was now standing in the face of it, ready to make a change. "Truth doesn't hide forever," he continued, his voice gaining strength with each word. "And the truth is that this system was never built for everyone. It was built to serve the few, the powerful, the ones who have always had a seat at the table. But what about the rest of us? What about the people who have worked just as hard, who have earned just as much, but are told time and again that they don't belong?"
As he spoke, Julian felt the weight of every racial injustice, every time he had been made to feel inferior, every moment of discrimination he had endured over the years. But he also felt something else: strength. He wasn't just telling his story. He was telling the stories of every person who had been denied their rightful place in society, who had been made to feel small and insignificant. And for the first time, Julian realized that he wasn't alone in this fight. The truth he was speaking wasn't just his truth, it was the truth of millions of people who had been silenced for far too long. The jury listened intently, the weight of Julian's words settling on them. They couldn't ignore it any longer. The evidence he had presented was overwhelming, years of policies and practices that had allowed racial discrimination to flourish unchecked. Julian had laid bare the truth about Sky Continental, and now it was up to the court to decide whether they would continue to allow this injustice to thrive, or whether they would take a stand for what was right. The tension in the room reached its peak as Julian finished his statement. "This is not just about me. It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. It's about everyone who has been denied their rightful seat at the table. And it's time for that to change." As Julian returned to his seat, the room remained silent, the impact of his words reverberating through the walls. The jury, the public, and even the defense attorneys seemed to be processing what they had just heard. The defense tried to shift the focus back to technicalities, to small details in the case that they could use to discredit the evidence. But it was too late. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no denying it.
The following days were filled with intense legal wrangling as both sides presented their closing arguments. But despite the defense's best efforts, The tide had already turned. Julian's testimony had resonated not just with the jury, but with the public. His courage had ignited a fire in people's hearts. It wasn't just about one airline anymore. It was about every corporation that had perpetuated a system of inequality and bias for generations. The media coverage exploded as news outlets picked up on Julian's powerful statement in court. Social media was abuzz with hashtags and messages of support flooding the internet. People from all over the world, many of whom had faced similar discrimination, shared their stories, flooding the courtroom with support from outside. This was no longer just a battle between Julian Carter and Sky Continental. This was a global movement. And Julian knew, deep down, that he had started something far bigger than himself.
When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Sky Continental had been found guilty of systemic racial discrimination, and the airline was ordered to make sweeping changes to its policies. The company was mandated to implement anti-bias training, overhaul its hiring and boarding practices, and publicly apologize for its actions. The victory was monumental, not just for Julian, but for every person who had ever felt marginalized, every person who had been told they didn't belong. Julian sat in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest as the judge's gavel fell. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moral one. Julian had taken a stand, and the world had responded. The victory felt bittersweet, though, as Julian knew the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. This is just the beginning. Change starts with one moment, one person who refuses to back down. Julian's words had proven true. This was just the beginning of a long road to justice. But Julian knew that the fight he had started would leave a lasting impact, one that would reverberate through industries far beyond the airline sector. His courage had ignited a fire, and now the world would be watching as the winds of change began to blow. As he left the courthouse, Julian took a deep breath, the weight of the fight settling into his bones. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a symbol of change, a man who had refused to back down in the face of injustice. And for the first time in a long time, Julian felt at peace, knowing that he had stood up for what was right, no matter the cost.
The weeks following the landmark verdict were a whirlwind for Julian Carter. Sky Continental, once an unmovable giant in the airline industry, had been forced to face its demons. The legal proceedings had forced the airline's leadership into a corner, and the evidence of racial discrimination within their ranks was undeniable. No amount of public relations spin, no glossy statements could hide the truth. Julian had made sure of that. The company had no choice but to implement the changes he had demanded. The airline's leadership, under intense pressure from both the public and its investors, finally acknowledged the systemic issues that had plagued the company for so long. Sky Continental began to roll out mandatory anti-bias training, revising its policies on passenger treatment and first-class accommodations. They introduced reforms aimed at diversity, equity, and inclusion, acknowledging the deep-rooted biases that had shaped their decisions for decades. The media heralded this as a victory, not just for Julian, but for the thousands of people who had been silenced by similar corporate indifference. The fight that had started as a single incident, a seemingly minor dispute over a seat, had grown into a global conversation about equality in the service industry, about the systemic racism that was too often hidden in plain sight. Julian sat at his desk late one evening, looking over the press releases and updates coming in from around the world. The changes at Sky Continental were just the beginning, but even now, he couldn't help but feel a bittersweet sense of accomplishment. They had done it. They had forced the airline to change. But Julian knew this victory was just one battle in a much larger war. The world, the system, wasn't going to change overnight. For every victory, there would be another fight waiting just around the corner.
His phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. She had been with him every step of the way, offering support, encouragement, and unwavering belief that this fight was bigger than any one company. "The changes at Sky Continental are just the beginning," she texted. "I've heard from multiple CEOs and industry leaders. They're all paying attention to what you did." Julian stared at the message for a moment, the weight of it settling in. This was more than just a victory for him. It was a movement. The world was paying attention now, and it was clear that this fight had struck a chord. People everywhere were talking about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. The Carter Protocol, a set of reforms Julian had proposed and fought for during the legal battle, had become a model for fairness in the service industry, not just in aviation, but across all sectors. It had quickly gained traction as a blueprint for how companies should handle discrimination, how they should treat all customers equally, and how they should be held accountable for their actions. News outlets from every corner of the globe were covering the case, but the conversation had shifted. This wasn't just about one man's fight. It was about the entire service industry rethinking its approach to diversity and equality. The Carter Protocol was being hailed as a new standard, with governments and organizations worldwide discussing how they could implement similar measures in their own industries. From hotel chains to restaurant groups, from airlines to banks, the protocol had sparked a global movement. Companies everywhere were realizing that treating customers fairly, regardless of their race or background, wasn't just a moral obligation, it was good business.
Julian had become the face of this change, but he was never one to take credit for what was truly a collective movement. He knew that his role in this was just the beginning of something far larger. He had ignited a spark, but it was the millions of people who had joined him, who had shared their stories and supported his cause, that were pushing this revolution forward. The seeds of change had been planted, and now they were beginning to grow. But as much as Julian took pride in what had been accomplished, there was a lingering awareness in the back of his mind. The fight for equality was far from over. The battle for racial justice, for the dismantling of systemic biases, was ongoing. There would be those who would try to undo the progress that had been made, who would try to sweep it all under the rug and pretend that nothing had changed. Julian knew that if he stopped now, if he let complacency settle in, everything he had fought for would be in jeopardy. He stood up from his desk, his hands resting on the edge of the table, his eyes gazing out at the skyline of the city below. He had fought hard for this moment, but Julian knew better than anyone that the work was far from finished. The moment of victory had arrived, but the struggle would continue. He couldn't rest on his laurels, not when so much more was at stake. There would be more battles to fight, more systems to change, and more people to stand up for.
Principles have no price. Those words echoed in his mind, a reminder that the fight for justice, for fairness, was priceless. Julian had never backed down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. As the world watched, as the industry adapted to the changes he had sparked, Julian felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just to his company, but to every person who had ever felt marginalized, who had ever been told they didn't belong. This wasn't just his victory. This was a victory for everyone who had ever faced discrimination. The next day, Julian stood in front of the press once again. But this time, it wasn't a courtroom or a legal battle. This time, it was a speech that would echo across the globe. The podium before him was packed with reporters and cameras, and as he looked out at the sea of faces, Julian knew the weight of what he had to say. "This isn't the end," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is just the beginning. Change starts with one moment, one person who refuses to back down. But it doesn't end here. It can't. We've made progress, yes, but the fight for fairness,
for justice will continue. And I will continue to stand for what is right, because principles have no price." As he finished speaking, Julian stepped away from the podium, his resolve stronger than ever. The world was watching, and as the Carter Protocol began to influence industries around the world, Julian knew that this moment in time, this fight for equality, would not be forgotten.
But even as he left the stage, he understood the reality of the work ahead. The movement was just getting started. Julian Carter had sparked a global shift, but the road to true equality was long and winding. And while the world had taken a significant step forward, Julian knew that he would have to remain vigilant, continue to push for progress, and never stop fighting for the fairness that every human being deserved. Because the fight for justice, like any great movement, was never really over. It was ongoing, a never-ending pursuit of what was right, and Julian, now a symbol of that fight, was ready to see it through. Thank you so much for sticking with us all the way to the end of this incredible story. If you found this journey captivating, just wait until you see what's coming next. The next story is even crazier, more gripping, and filled with twists that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Just click on the image on your screen right now to dive into the next chapter. Thanks again for watching, and get ready for more thrilling adventures.